Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Caroline Sherd. I will be the facilitator for our discussion over the use of disruptive technology and terrorism. I'm a junior here at West Point and I'm majoring in international affairs with a minor in terrorism studies. Our panelists for tonight's event are Ms. Audrey Alexander and Mr. Don Ressler. Ms. Audrey Alexander is a researcher and instructor at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. In that role, Alexander studies a range of topics, including terrorist exploitation of technology and the nexus of gender and violent extremism, and regularly engages with different facets of the counterterrorism community. Her work regularly appears in publications and briefings in the academic, policy, and practitioner communities. Before joining the center, Alexander served as a senior research fellow at the George Washington University's program on extremism and previously worked in the International Center, for the study of radicalization. Alexander holds a master's degree in terrorism, security, and society from the War Studies Department at King's College London. Dr. Don Ressler is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences and director of strategic initiatives at the Combating Terrorism Center as well, at the United States Military Academy. His research interests cover a wide array of topics to include how terrorist groups innovate and use technology and the evolution of counterterrorism practices and strategy. Ressler has conducted counterterrorism-focused assessments for headquarters staff and advised operational units in overseas environments. Ressler's work has been cited by various outlets such as the New York Times, Washington Post, and Foreign Policy. Prior to joining the CTC, Ressler worked on intelligence, defense reform, and NATO transformation projects with the emphasis on the Balkans for the Department of Defense as a senior consultant with DICA. He holds an MA in International Affairs from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and a BS from the University of Oregon. Miss Alexander and Dr. Ressler, thank you for joining us tonight. And with that, we'll get it kicked off. I'll ask some questions and then we'll go from there. The first question is, in your opinion, what is the largest threat that terrorists use as disruptive technology poses to the United States and why?
Should I kick us off?
Kick it off, Audrey.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, on the record, just want to say thanks again for having us. We're super excited to be here promoting both the Combating Terrorism Center, but also the Terrorism Studies minor, which if people want to learn more, they can feel free to reach out to us about. So today in the discussion about looking at disruptive technologies, I would actually make the case that one of the biggest disruptive technologies today is one of the same challenges that we've seen time and time again. I believe that information and communications technologies are really an underlying threat that enable other technologies to be abused and exploited. So in the event that we look at organizations that are trying to leverage more advanced approaches or even trying to pursue like biological weapons, for example, I can't envision a world where that happens outside of a place involving information and communications technologies. Whether it's even getting to the point where they are reaching out to other contacts, trying to fund more sophisticated attacks, trying to detonate something. All of these tools tend to use information and communications technologies to get there. So I really see that as an enduring challenge that is something that we must continue to pay attention to.
Great question. Yeah, and just thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. SCUS is a big event, and if you're not familiar with CTC, come check us out. So, that's a good lead-off question. What's the largest, threat that terrorist use of disruptive technology pose to the United States and why? Answering this question is a little tricky because disruptive technologies, it's difficult to predict or envision where they're going to go and how terrorist groups or individual people, societies are going to embrace or not embrace or utilize disruptive technologies. And so the way that I thought about this question is sort of my response is two-pronged. And so if I were to bucket the largest threat, or sort of what I would view as the largest threat, is sort of one piece would be looking at how terrorist groups in the recent past have innovated in meaningful ways, not necessarily using disruptive technology, but how their innovations themselves through the use of technology have been disruptive. And so one of those is looking at sort of one threat vector that I would look at or consider would be the creative cobbling together of technologies, and in some cases, technologies that are emerged or that are, quote, more cutting edge. Things like, in the past, commercially available drones, quadcopters, and looking at what the Islamic State did, which was cobbling together the more cutting edge technology that was commercially available through, say, DJI Phantom quadcopter drones, and matching that or cobbling that together with mundane technology, nuts and bolts and different things that allowed the Islamic State to take something that was accessible and you could purchase on the internet or in various shops at a hobby shop, and then add on certain things in a cheap way to make it, to weaponize a drone. That was cost effective for a group like the Islamic State. That was a profound thing that they did, but it wasn't because they had access to disruptive technology. It was because they were creative about blending together different technologies with unique approaches. So when I think about disruptive technologies and sort of the future threat of terrorism, that's one area that I look at. You could look at it through the lens of software that's available. So, there's software that exists that has been used with drones that allows a drone to detect crowd size. So you want to, harm a lot of people and you have that sinister intent. Maybe it's not dropping ammunition. Maybe there's a chem bio application that allows you to hone in on the biggest crowd and sort of blending these things together. So that's one vector. Another vector that, I would be concerned about in terms of disruptive technology is looking at insider threats. And so, the case that I think about here is the Amerithrax investigation case immediately after 2001 and the 9/11 attacks. Of the use of anthrax. It was, tied to an insider who worked for the U.S. Army in terms of sending letters with anthrax to various congressional offices and news outlets. And so as we think about disruptive technology, it's the people who have access to those technologies who, we need to be very thoughtful and concerned about how, if somebody goes rogue or wants to use, what they know and access to things that they might have in sinister ways.
Thank you. So kind of going off that question then, and off of your explanations, how could the United States counteract the terrorist use of disruptive technology, and maybe they're coupling with not disruptive technology, but how they utilize that and possibly use it against the terrorist organizations?
So again, I'll tackle this one first. I think that in many ways, we shouldn't try to use the tools that they're trying to use against us against them, because it sort of operates outside of a landscape that we're comfortable in. But I will say that first and foremost, and this is regardless of how technologically sophisticated, we need to remain really grounded in the threats that are actually emerging instead of just our perception of the threats that are emerging. Now, that's different from trying to red team and anticipate threats that are possible. And I think developing really good analytic methodologies to try and figure out what's possible, what's likely, instead of just saying this is how we perceive it. Because in the past, I think we've grounded a lot of our counterterrorism policies in our perceptions of threats rather than like a really solid understanding of how tools are being exploited and abused. So I think the first sort of element is staying really aware of tools that are being developed and how those technologies, what's their potential for exploitation. Whether it's really, really basic or complicated ways that they're doing it. And one of the things that we can also do is look at criminal networks and see how other actors are abusing tools. And sort of in line with that, once we have increased awareness, we can be better at detection and disruption and prevention. And that's sort of like a multi-pronged approach to, prevent things from developing, stop them when they have developed, and deal with them if it has already sort of come to fruition. And I think that one of the big advantages that states have is the opportunity to work a lot more with different sectors, whether it's private industry in the private sector, whether you're working with like banks or technology providers, or also civil society groups. So trying to use multiple access points to curb the growth of technology and tech exploitation would sort of be my consideration there. But that all, again, comes from a basis of having a much better and dynamic understanding of what's possible and what's probable.
Yeah, I like the way that Audrey framed it. I'll steal her phrase, the potential for exploitation. So I think that one area to think about is how can we create incentives and forums to model or to evaluate, test out, think through how, whether it's disruptive technologies or specific categories of or types of technology can be or might be used by terrorist adversaries in sinister ways, or in ways that enhance their position, or that they can, leverage either weaponizing or to recruit, do all sorts of things. And so, that would be one recommendation is, and by that I mean sort of, you look at the case of drones and commercially available drones, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to look at the, flashback 5 years and to say, hey, these tools might actually be, if you're an Islamic State, weapons developer or planner, this is a useful tool. I would like to get some drones and use them because we don't have an Air Force, we don't have, surveillance capability. And so it's fairly predictable that the Islamic State and other terrorist groups, as they're using now, would be interested in drones and acquiring quadcopter or other drones. And so, but what else could they do? And so that's where I think bringing together, communities that think about creative application of technologies like DIY hobbyists to sort of, figure out ways that their expertise, their creative way of problem solving, when they don't necessarily have a lot of resources, can be that they can help to model or to test out, or to think about how specific technologies or tools can be creatively utilized, and match those people with specialists who are help to develop those tools from industry. And so that type of creative clustering of people with different skill sets and experiences to model out things, I think, is one path. Another suggestion would be on the acquisition side. So when we're talking about specific hardware or maybe even software to a certain extent, is trying to figure out ways that we can responsibly develop ways to learn more about how particular groups or individuals acquire technologies that we're concerned about. In the drones example, there were, examples of Islamic State purchasers purchasing drones from U.S. and other international companies and sending those to the border of Syria. That's a sort of know your customer issue that, maybe in the future it might be worth to think about. There's an active conflict zone that's 20 miles away from where you're shipping this, that maybe there are ways to, on the supply chain side, that we could illuminate or help industry illuminate some of those potentially problematic areas where weapons and equipment or software are being sent, to be more proactive in helping to disrupt some of that activity. Lastly, what else can we do? I mean, one important test case here is the U.S. government's use of artificial intelligence, machine learning. We've been doing that for quite a while, and leveraging machine learning to disrupt certain activity, whether it's on the private industry side with terrorist communications and leveraging digital platforms, or on the operational side, leveraging AI to help limit collateral damage and focus in on who the United States should or can target.
Thank you. Those are some interesting suggestions, and kind of building off of that. And like you touched on the United States partnering with some of these corporations. How would you I guess expound on that some more to use some of the tools and procedures for combating terrorism? Like, how would you make that into I guess an everyday thing, or would you?
Yeah, so sort of jumping on this question, and I think it is a really good extension of the last question, is that over the last 20 years, because of the evolving nature of the threat and our increased understanding of the threat, we've realized when more players need to be at the table, or which players make sense for the multiple tables we need to be at. So I think that the example that we've sort of flagged already with drones is a really interesting example, because number one, like, we have the law enforcement agencies. So we've got, domestic actors, international actors. So that means you have a suite of different players within the intelligence community involved. So those players need to effectively communicate with each other and figure out whose job is to do what. And then sort of layered onto that, we have working with international partners, and they're equally complex, different frameworks. So whether they have folks who are focusing on the international landscape or the domestic landscape, and then also, while working with international partners, making sure we're bridging out to other players. So whether it is private industry and folks who are selling these, or who is couriering them. So who's actually like shipping the supplies or the materials, who plays a role in acquisitions. So I think that over the last 20 years, we've gotten a lot better at identifying like when we need to work with different partners and starting to forge relationships with them. And in my own career, I've had a lot of experience working with the tech communications industry. And one of the challenges when I talk to service providers, no, my lights are turning off. One of the challenges when I stay humble, everyone, talk to service providers is that on a day-to-day basis, sometimes they get mixed messages because of the US government. One department or agency will reach out to them and have a really productive engagement on one topic. And then the next day, somebody else in a different part of government reaches out to them about something else, not having any awareness that the company worked with another partner in the government. So we need to streamline and find ways to more effectively communicate with partners. So we know more and more that we need to talk with folks, but now it's about making that a more efficient and pragmatic process, which is something that just takes like getting the reps in and getting that experience. Because I think that especially with some of these companies, they're really, really small and their capabilities are limited. And the same may happen when it comes to looking at other industries, or they could be really, really big and bureaucratic and harder to navigate. So just sort of taking considerations for all of the stakeholders that need to be at the table is something we're getting a lot better at, but it's also an opportunity for improvement.
Audrey nailed it. Don't really have much to add. Reduce barriers to collaboration, collapse boundaries, make data accessible. That's what I got, in addition to what Audrey said.
Okay. So that's a great segue to the next question of homegrown violent extremist groups such as the Proud Boys, 3%ers, and other subsets of QAnon. How did they utilize technology such as deep fakes to further their agenda, recruit more followers, deepen the societal polarization, and how do you think the United States can combat that through our collaboration? Is it possible, I guess?
Don, would you like to tee up this one?
Sure. Yeah, so I think with this one, I'd be curious to what Audrey's take is. But like when I think about this question, homegrown violent extremists or domestic violent extremists, whatever want to call this category of groups and individuals. I think that when I look at sort of their activity, I don't see there being a lot of emphasis placed on disruptive technology. Now, that it isn't to say that those communities will not embrace disruptive technology, in the future, or maybe when disruptive technologies become more accessible and mainstream. I think that that's a future that is likely. But I think that, like, to me, what's interesting about the activity of this category of actors is just that they are trying to leverage all of the tools that are at their disposal that they can legally utilize to spread their message. And so they're using every platform in whatever ways that they can that try and advance their worldview and their narratives. And so I think that, to me, the concern here is less about their use of or embrace of disruptive technology or disruptive approaches. It's the sort of awareness of how to navigate the seams of terms of service and to sort of stay active and online on select platforms, but do so in a way that erodes trust in institutions and trust in government, U.S. government and other governments. And so, to me, that's the disruptive piece, is that they have figured out a way to sort of exist in this online ecosystem and to try and mainstream their narratives and tie them to issues that a lot of people can sympathize and get behind to advance more radical causes. I think that's the disruptive aspect, and I think that that's the real danger. And to me, the danger is about the fracturing of trust in government, which over the long term is obviously dangerous.
Yeah, so honestly, my point really is in line with what Mr. Rausser was arguing, because the thesis for how these groups are using it is really that they're using standard technologies in a disruptive way, really, really effectively. So it's not necessarily disruptive technology in sort of the same level as like targeting critical infrastructure or using CRISPR, like, using AI to identify like the right crowd size to drop ordnance. But it's so effective at doing what they're trying to do, especially in that erosion of trust and building communities. So I think that one of the challenges is that these really simple tactics are effective at spreading misinformation, so that deep fakes aren't even necessarily required. Deep fakes can be expensive and difficult to make, and state actors might be interested in producing and pumping out some of that content. But in the interim, not only could that be disseminated, but whatever that deep fake is trying to convey may become a news story that can, reach the same virality without the same cost. So I think that part of the challenge is really that contemporary technologies have allowed decentralization in a way that is makes it really difficult to streamline folks. And then there's also this virality component that is really conducive to the erosion of trust, but not necessarily the rebuilding of trust, if that makes sense.
Yes, ma'am. So that's a good kind of platform for a follow-up question that you already touched on. What problems do you think terrorist use of disruptive technology or social media pose to the government in terms of shaping societal perspectives on certain issues?
If I can jump in on this one. So I worked with another colleague, a plug for the CTC Sentinel. I worked with Bennett Clifford on a piece about the Islamic State's cyber capabilities and perceptions versus reality of what their cyber capabilities really entailed. Because for several years, there's a lot of hullabaloo about how advanced the Islamic State was and what they were capable of doing. But when you start to dig into it, and sometimes these investigations take a long time for all of the information to sort of come to the top so that we can engage with it publicly. But for one thing, the things that were more serious seemed not to be ISIS related, really. It was more that there were actors that sort of appropriated ISIS or never really shirked ISIS's banner when they were attributed to the Islamic State, when later on it ended up being a range of different actors, including cyber actors, threat groups that were state supported. So then when we look at what ISIS's activities really were, one of the things that they did is basically hack into a government Twitter account and start posting content. So they framed that as like, this was a government hack. Well, it was the hack of a government Twitter account. That is not the same as hacking into, resources or databases that have personally identifiable information. So similarly, a different attack was basically used to target a recreation store. So everybody who used their DoD ID or DoD email to purchase carabiners in mass or, water bottles in mass, they could search through the database, isolate all of the DoD emails, and they published that on a kill list. So the kill list never actually manifested in anybody being killed. So the group never really mobilized to act on behalf of that. There were people who expressed interest, but they never actually got sort of to the action part. But the other thing is that's still not hacking a government site. There are entities capable of doing those activities, but the violent extremists in the Islamic State that I was studying, based on court filings, media reports, and so on, they didn't have the capability to do that, and yet they were able to project that capability. People thought that they did because they were able to really manipulate that narrative and sort of puff up their chest and make themselves seem a lot bigger than they were. And not a lot of people necessarily followed along with the story to say, 2 years later, this isn't anything what it really looked like. And part of that circles back to a point I raised earlier about making sure we have real understandings of the threats and perception, like accurate perceptions of the threats, not just sort of a gut instinct, because of course it's scary when it first comes out. And the media tends to sensationalize it because there are incentives to talk about these things in intimidating ways, I guess, but it's sort of being able to right size that and really understand the threat and their capabilities, because we need to be aware of the fact that terrorist groups don't really need to have that advanced capabilities to make a big impact. So, as they do pursue more and more tools, that's going to up the ante in terms of their intimidation, even if they're not really successful at it.
Yeah, so with this question, one thing that I would think about is you framed it around sort of terrorist use of disruptive technology. And that's a useful way to think about this. But I think that another way to think about this would be to sort of step back a little bit and say, all right, how are other adversaries, to include near-peer rivals, like say, Russia or China, how do these issues potentially intersect? And we see in the sort of misinformation, disinformation space is an area where there's unfortunately a lot of opportunity. And so while, let's sort of think about our current moment and where we've been over the last 18 months, and to sort of think about the politics of the pandemic and pandemic responses and those dynamics, or to think about our election and internal divisions in this country and a sort of the sort of rigorous debate about their foreign contacts, elections, election interference, all of those dynamics, and sort of think about it through the lens of, all right, if you're, say, a near-peer rival like Russia or China, what are you incentivized to do? What is in potentially your interest that you can do that is sort of, that you could potentially help to enable? And you might think that maybe it's to enable further division and some of these fractures through misinformation and disinformation here in the United States, through some of the groups that, and others that you mentioned and others that you didn't mention, here domestically in the United States. And so, maybe another way to think about this issue is also just sort of how terrorist groups or extremist groups are either known or perhaps unwitting proxy there's opportunity for them to be enabled by near peer competitors in various threat arenas. And that's a very dangerous thing where, we have a fractured landscape here. And while your question's about terrorism, it might be also helpful to sort of collapse that a little bit, look at more broadly about if we're looking at disruptive impact, it might be the marrying of some of those near peer activities with the sort of proxies through the lens or, the face of witting or not, likely not, through extremist groups here in the United States. And so that's, just another way to think about this.
Thank you, sir and ma'am. So going off that, broadening the lens a little bit, would you say that the problem is not with terrorist use of disruptive technology, but more so the United States trying to get to get people within the government and within society to recognize that balance between perception and their actual capabilities, but then also more focused on identifying, I guess, our foreign adversaries' use of it as opposed to terrorists?
I'd say it's probably both. And I think the point about, proxies are really starting to change the game because there's this liminal space that can be used, opportunistically by multiple actors. And sometimes, a state and their proxy will align and say, hey, it makes sense for us to use violence in this way or use this technology in this way. So we do need to be really aware of that. But I think it's, it's manifold. And I think that the public opinion, public perception part is a big part of it. And why I argue that is because when you look back at sort of what is the purpose of terrorism, is terrorism trying to intimidate or coerce a population to put pressure on the government to change its policies. So if these disruptive technologies really effectively intimidate the population, which they seem to be doing in a lot of cases, then that's where we need to sort of combat the influence that those acts have on the population with regard to intimidating or coercing the population into a certain outcome. So, that's not a perfect answer, but it's trying to say that, like, that's where I see one tension is that, we do need to talk about, like, stopping the actual actors themselves, no doubt. But in pursuit of stopping the actors is disincentivizing or making it less attractive to pursue these methods because the population is more resilient and more critical of what they're actually trying to pursue.
I think Audrey handled it well. Yeah, I don't have anything else to add on that.
And the SS 465 response, which is our introduction to terrorism class for those who haven't taken it yet.
Take it.
Thank you. That's a good way of, I guess, framing it and kind of going forward and how we should be looking at these type of problems as we encounter them in society. So more of a contemporary question, breaking apart from what we've been discussing with smaller immediate physical force in the Middle East due to the country's recent withdrawal from Afghanistan. How has or has not the role of disruptive technology changed in our combating the terrorist organizations that originate or claim hubs in the region? So has it even affected it at all?
I can jump on this one first. Yeah, so one of the fundamental challenge with Afghanistan is how do we conduct counterterrorism? How do we still conduct counterterrorism operations and, through unilateral operations, potentially partnered operations in the future, still to be decided. And the president has spoken about this. Key national security figures have spoken about sort of the need to do this at a greater standoff distance. Without the ability to conduct operations physically on the ground in Afghanistan, or at least have the posture that we previously had prior to withdrawal. And so, it's a multi-tiered issue where revolving around that same challenge of how do we understand and track and situate through various sensors, which we used to be on the ground to help facilitate where these threats are going, what that threat picture looks like. How do you do that from a greater distance? And obviously there are ways to do that. The fact of physically not being present in a place like Afghanistan, is there a sort of diminishment of those sensors? Absolutely, no doubt. That's a key challenge. So on the sort of collection aspect, there's a sort of how do we understand the problem? How do we continue to get information about sort of threat trajectories of specific organizations or individuals that we're concerned about in a place like Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State Khorasan province, other factions of the Afghan Taliban or Afghan Taliban senior leadership, being frank, in terms of some of their ties. How do we do that? How do we, once we have information that we want to action, how do we action that information? Whether that's through a targeted operation, utilizing something like a drone, or maybe it's a financially motivated operation where we're trying to target the Taliban or Al-Qaeda linked finances that have connections to Afghanistan or Pakistan. And so that's where, technology and, perhaps disruptive technologies come to play, or could play a greater role, is that they could help us they are helping us and will play an even more central role. We need to figure out how we can leverage different tools that we have to help reduce the sort of that gap of our ability. We're no longer there on the ground. And how do we try and remain effective and leverage various tools and technologies to shorten, close that gap a little bit. It's not a perfect science. It's a work in progress. But you can, look at it through the lens of, what type of investments can the U.S. make in machine learning and artificial intelligence to understand what's happening in certain places. There was an interesting study that was done last year through RAND that looked at nighttime lighting, use of satellite imagery to understand how nighttime lighting was changing in relation to whether or not the Chinese government was still operating detention camps that were housing Uyghurs in in Xinjiang region, whether the Chinese government was still operating those facilities. And nighttime lighting was a proxy to be able to understand if those facilities were still being used. So, it's not the perfect example, but are there other examples like that of, hey, how do we leverage those types of resources, which we've been aware of, but might have to leverage, those types of data in other creative ways to get a sense of how things are evolving and how we could action them if that's something that we want to do.
Yeah, and sort of building on that, and this is more of like a big picture discussion, but, when you talk about even like how to do this on the microcosm of a platform, if they're going to use AI, then they want to have human oversight. So like kind of the gold standard is using advanced technology plus human safeguards, and then constantly check these two against each other to refine the product and improve the tooling. I mean, one of the things about this space is it is predictive and it's also not predictive. I have read every single court filing of IS in America cases, and I, monitor that because I'm very passionate about that. And there are often times where I'm still surprised because humans act in ways that we aren't calculating. It's even with great tools, you can have trouble predicting, what did they miss the bus? Were they like 3 minutes late? So they chose another route to get into a country, or like, did their fixer not show up? So the other fixer brought them a different way. Did they change out the SIM card at the last minute because like it just wasn't working with their device? There's so many tiny things that we need to be able to really keep a pulse on human dynamics and how those evolve, and then also get better at applying those tools and trying to get the tools to understand the evolution of natural behavior. But then I also think it's about partnerships still. even in places where we have limited or denied access, it's going to be a lot about developing good relationships at like a state level, at an organizational level between like NGOs and humanitarian organizations, but also at an interpersonal level. So being able to really leverage relationship building to increase understanding and awareness of data is so critical, because we may look at things and be able to synthesize something and say, this is the way it is from this graph. But if you factor in one other variable, it tells an entirely different story. So being able to have that cultural awareness and, on the ground awareness is really critical. So figuring out what that looks like in Afghanistan, but also in other denied areas around the world, will be really important.
Thank you. Those are all valuable insights that'll help us analyze and think critically about these contemporary issues. With that, we're just about out of time. So do either of you have any closing comments that you would like to add?
Thank you so much for facilitating this and having us join. Happy to be here and participating in a remote environment where we are able to connect despite the challenges.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll second that. And thanks for the opportunity. Hope SCUSA is a big success this year. And CTC, we're a resource for all of you. And so if you're not familiar with us, come see us in Lincoln Hall, and or sign up for one of our courses, or even if you just have questions about terrorism or counterterrorism, that's what we're here for. So thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.